Welcome to the Ranchonomics podcast, where we empower you to build a better ranch and transform your operations into a thriving business. I'm your host, John Haskell. Let's get started. Good morning. This morning I have Chloe Diegel with me from Nebraska. She is the wife of Alex McKiernan, who we spoke with a few weeks ago for the podcast. Chloe, good morning. Nice to have you.
Good morning, John.
And you are with Robinette Farms in Nebraska, correct?
That's right.
Where do you live?
We live in the southeast corner of Nebraska. So if anyone remembers their fifth grade geography, Lincoln is the capital of Nebraska. And we live about 15 minutes southwest of Lincoln. So we're real close to Lincoln.
Love it. Very good. Well, this is a bit of a continuation of a couple of episodes we did with Alex. Alex, as most of you may remember, if you haven't heard those episodes, be best to listen to them. Alex was involved in a car crash one day while you guys were working. And I wanted to speak with you for a couple of reasons. One, we often get the first person take of how do we, deal with that and recover from that, and how is our mentality affected and how does it impact our recovery? But there's, of course, the second person involved in that accident, which, of course, is always our spouse or our parents or some other person very close to us. So, Chloe, I appreciate you being willing to talk to us about that, because I'm sure this is, the funnest day of your life. But let's get right into it and talk a little about, day one. What happened? How did you hear about this?
Yeah. It's certainly one of those big markers in your life, right? That you will never forget. It was January of 2014. And at the time, we had an almost 4-year-old. Our oldest daughter was almost 4. And we had twin daughters who were 9 months old.
And twins just by themselves have to be plenty challenging.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Nothing to see here, right?
Yeah. Nothing's easy here. This was a progression of, in December, finding like, oh, okay, there's 2 babies in there. Having them in April, we were able to purchase our farm in the fall of 2013 when they were like 6 months old. And then the car crash in January when they were about 9 months old. So that day, it was just after the twins were born, and somewhat before. I was just home with them. I wasn't doing much work on the farm. I had been the primary farmer for our farm. And, throughout that pregnancy, obviously, at a certain point, I couldn't do much of anything. So I had mostly been home, and Alex had taken the primary farmer role after the twins were born. So, but January, there's nothing going on anyway. So we're just home, house is in chaos. And the twins were both still nursing. So we're on a couch, everybody's propped up and we're nursing. It's a beautiful sunny day. Alex had gone to town to run a bunch of errands and drop off some produce. And one of our neighbors calls me and I'm like, what does Chuck want? He's probably, at that time, a lot of people thought my number was Alex's phone number. So I would often get calls from people that I know they didn't want to talk to me. So our neighbor calls and I'm like, that's probably not for me. I'm going to ignore it. And I'm nursing the twins. And then not that long after, 10 minutes later or something, Alex is on the volunteer fire department and one of the Southwest trucks pulls up in our driveway and I'm like, what do they want? I was like, whatever, they're probably coming to pick something up. Things happen that I do not need to be involved in. I just kind of ignored it. And then they come and knock on the door and I'm like, hey guys, like, what's up? And, they're still in all their gear and then they let me know what happened. And really, it was just like, you become zombie almost, and it was so useful because they were just like, okay, it's okay. This is what's going on. They kind of gave me like the play by play. And then they're like, get the kids together. We'll drive you to the hospital. They basically like told me what to do. Can you call your mom? Can the kids be with your mom? Like they knew me well enough and our story well enough that they could help me make some of those initial decisions when I was just in shock, So then I just remember getting minimal, I don't even know what I packed, probably the dumbest things to give to my mom to care for the children. So, packed everybody up, and our neighbor Chuck, who was on the department as well, drove me and the girls up to the hospital. And then my mom met us there because she lived in town at the time. Took the kids, she and my dad and my cousin took care of the kids the rest of that day. And then it was just at that point, it was waiting in the ER and just sitting there and sitting there and sitting there and waiting and not knowing what was going on, not really knowing what anything meant. And then when I finally got to see him, I immediately knew he was right. And he probably told that story. I knew he was mentally fine immediately by the way he was responding to me and the stories he was telling.
He actually didn't tell that story. I've heard him tell that before, but maybe you'd tell it from your side, because I think this actually was about the best thing he could do for you at that point. But I'd like to get your perspective.
Well, I am not the storyteller of the family, so his story is way better than mine. But I basically, the first moment I was allowed to see him, he had done whatever, all these tests and blah, 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 blah. And he was in, like an emergency ER room, and he had had a little cut on his heel from the crash, like a laceration on his heel. And so he was lying there, obviously like super drugged up. And the ER doc is stitching up the laceration on his heel and, just in there. And I come in and see him and I give him a kiss and I'm like crying. And he starts telling me this story. And I actually I probably shouldn't tell it on the podcast exactly, but,
Slightly inappropriate. Yes.
Yeah, it's a little inappropriate. So he starts kind of like digging into this ER doc and he's like, this guy, did this to me and blah, blah, blah. Kind of as like a really harsh joke, to the ER doc. And I kind of look at that guy and he's just like not saying anything. And then I look at him and I'm like, oh my God, okay, you're okay. Your brain is okay. You're like, you are mentally fine. We don't know about your body yet, but you are mentally okay. So that was the first day. And then it was just so many unknowns for a long time.
Has Alex been an amateur comedian the whole time you've known him, or?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good.
He's a storyteller,
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, great.
Yeah. For him, even on a lot of drugs, for him to like immediately try to make a joke and make it lighthearted, that was the indicator to me that like, oh, okay, you're okay. You're still there.
And I can imagine after you sitting in the waiting room for hours, having no idea what's going on, like there was a lot of tension there to be released fairly quickly, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Very good. All right. So I don't just want to talk about this accident, because I think this has led you guys, as we talked about with Alex, into a lot of different places, but certainly led you to a lot of growth and development, I'm sure. And I'd kind of like to talk about that. So maybe we can talk about the next phase of how did you guys kind of get through that? And then what did you use to help you through that? Because there's an awful lot going on there between, the potential of losing your spouse and losing a lot of your spouse's capacity, the fact that you guys are in business together, the fact that you have 3 young children, like this, there's a lot going on here. So how in the world did you get through that? Because I know, if I told my wife that was going to be what happened to her next week, she would say, yep, I could not do that. We have 3 kids also, not twins. But, 3 kids on your own in a business is a lot going on. So how did we proceed from there? Do you know somebody that's wrestling with serious medical issues and all the expenses that go with it? If so, go to hiscavvyfoundation.com, Cavvy spelled CAVVY, apply or nominate them for assistance from the foundation, where we help people in the ranching business get through those things together.
Yeah, I mean, no one would say, sure, I could handle that. No one's going to say, no big deal, I got it. Absolutely in the initial time frame, the car crash, and while he was in rehab, we relied so heavily on our community, family and community. We had various family members come in for several days to a week at a time and just stay at our house and play with kids and change diapers and go see Alex, or let me go see Alex without children. because he was in a hospital and we had twins that were crawling and touching and putting their mouth on everything, which is disgusting in the hospital. So it was not practical.
The last place in the world you want them to do that, right? Yeah.
Exactly. It was not practical to have them there. So, family for a long time and setting up meal trains and care trains. It was so critical. Someone showed up to my house every night for weeks to bring us food or play with our oldest daughter while I put the twins to bed. Sometimes I knew who the people were. Sometimes I didn't. Like
Wow.
some random person, I'd be like, okay, well, this is the person's name who's showing up tonight. I don't know who they are. Apparently, they're a friend of this person that I know not very well. Okay, great. So it was phenomenal. I mean, just the power of community and really the power of like, we made concerted effort to be involved in our community. And because our business is direct to consumer and, we were doing a lot of farmers markets, we knew we had a visibility in our larger community as well. So that was so incredible and so meaningful. And there's no way I could have done that completely by myself. And my parents couldn't be there 100% of the time. They were both working full time at that point in their lives. And we didn't have like a massive extended family network in our area. So we really relied on the community. And that's really the only way that it was possible. I think, I'm naturally just kind of a go with the flow person. But that really tested that. And people would say, well, what's your plan for this? And I'd be like, I literally don't know what I'm doing in an hour. Like there is no plan. There was no plan for a long time. And it just didn't feel, there was no mental capacity to plan, one. And number two, like things were changing very rapidly for what felt like several weeks. And a few years later, we have a lot of tornadoes in Nebraska, and there was like a piece on the local news on the radio about this big tornado 20 years later. And they were kind of revisiting people they interviewed after this big tornado 20 years later. And someone in that interview just said, well, I didn't realize until a year or two later that I was just surviving those first years. I was just surviving. There was nothing else but survival going on, just the basics. And I went, oh my God, like that exactly describes it. Like you're just putting one foot in front of the other. There's no goals. There's no dreams. There's none of that. There's no planning. It's just like, okay, let's get to the next thing that's happening later today or tomorrow.
Yep.
Which is exhausting, and you don't realize how you're not really living your life in that mode. You just can't. And unfortunately, there are lots of people in that world, in our world, that live that all the time, where you're just living one moment to the next because that's all you can do.
Okay, so give us some details. How long was Alex in the hospital? How long was he, highly incapacitated? How long was he partial? Like, what was the recovery process like?
Yeah, so he didn't need surgery or anything after the car crash, which is pretty amazing, actually. So he was only in the hospital for maybe 3 days before he got transferred to the rehabilitation hospital. And thankfully, we have like a world-class rehab hospital in Lincoln. So he was really close. He didn't have to go, to Kansas or Colorado or anything like that, or Chicago. So he was right there. And he was at Madonna Rehab for 2 full months. So he was not home. And the first 2 weeks after the car crash, he was fully paralyzed, like couldn't move anything. And then right around like when the hospital had scheduled like his first home visit to go home, and they did kind of an assessment what would need to change for someone in a wheelchair to be in this home, and they could recommend things or whatever. So it was kind of a home assessment. And so right around that time at 2 weeks, he could start, he was moving a toe, and then it kind of progressed from there. So he was fully paralyzed for 2 weeks. And, he had a lot of nerve pain. So he was definitely medicated for the first couple weeks as things are adjusting and recalibrating in his body. But he started doing therapy day one when he was at Madonna. So then he was there for another 6 weeks after that. Once he could move, they really got him on the fast track of like, okay, we're going to progress you towards seeing how far we can get you back to walking. So then it got really intense after that. And he was able to walk out of Madonna with a walker the day that he was discharged. And now he's mostly around in crutches. If he were going to the airport or traveling, he'll be in his wheelchair. And then around the house, it's a lot easier to be in a wheelchair than walking around on crutches.
And you have two hands you can use.
You probably have seen him use both.
Yep.
Wheelchair and crutches. Yep.
I have. And my first thought when I see him in a wheelchair is Alex is kind of a big guy. Like dragging him up there would be a bit of a challenge, I imagine, huh?
Yeah. Thankfully, I didn't ever have to do that.
Well, that's good. Okay. Thank you for listening. We're going to conclude part 1 of this interview today and continue next week. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for tuning into the Ranchonomics podcast. We hope this episode helped you win today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend.